There was a lot made of the entire Auburn coaching search. You know what? Actually, we haven't spoken about that in a while. So let's take ourselves back to December. Remember, there was that whole mess down there at Auburn. Gus Malzahn's fired. It's my opinion, in any other generation, what he was doing would be good enough because, there were times where you looked at those blind resume comparisons and what he was doing was trending very comparable to a guy they named the field after down there in Pate. But it wasn't good enough because you are judged, fair or not, against the backdrop of Nick Saban's Alabama in today's college football, especially if you are Auburn. And so Gus Malzahn's out. I'm not here to relitigate that. But then it looks like Kevin Steele's going to get the job, and then you got a bunch of other names that are thrown in there, and Bryan Harsin was not among them, and he comes out of left field. Literally, he's all the way up in Boise, and so a guy who, as Brandon Marcello wrote today on 247sports.com, a guy who's never lived east of the Mississippi River is all of a sudden the head coach at Auburn. So kind of the same way when Ryan Day was hired at Ohio State, a lot of people looked at Auburn hiring Bryan Harsin and said, whomst? They hired him as what coordinator? No, he's going to be the head coach there. The head coach? What? Why? They couldn't do better than that? Well, that was the initial impression. And so I just want to, a lot of you don't understand Auburn because Auburn is a very unique place. So if you've never been there, you don't really get it. And they'll be quick to tell you that if you haven't already heard that. But they're right about it. It's a very special town. I grew up very close to it. It's a unique culture. The game day atmosphere is second to none. There's a spirit there. Like, the people are very, very proud. They're very invested. It's kind of, in the context of college football, it's got a very high school football feel to it. The way that once you get inside that bubble, you understand it. But if you're not inside that bubble, it makes no sense. So again, Marcello writes a piece over on 247sports.com today that I would encourage you to go read because he spoke with Bryan Harsin. I mean, I remember when he did this piece, he sat there in the office with him. So he got a lot of really good access with Bryan Harsin. And Harsin was very open about saying at the very beginning of this whole process, he didn't know a whole lot about Auburn. And over time, Alan Green, the athletic director there, he really let him hang. Just to be honest with you, in this whole process, Alan Green's the right guy for the job at Auburn because he had some people kind of figuratively try and shove him, but Alan Green's the wrong guy to try and shove, and the wrong people tried to shove him, and he just stood there, kind of deadpanned him, and then they cowered, as those kinds of people tend to do, and then you get the president on your side, and you can go make your hire. Instead of making a typical Auburn hire, they got to make the right hire, and they used the right process to go make the hire. So books will be written about that one day. But now you got Bryan Harsin on campus. Well, here's the follow-up question. How's he going to win in the SEC? How's he going to win at Auburn? What does he know about Auburn? How's he going to assemble a staff? How does he know how to recruit in the Southeastern Conference? There are a couple of things I'm sure of. Number one, I'm sure of the fact that I think the Auburn job is the hardest in America. Number two, I think Bryan Harsin doesn't really care about that. So both of those things can be true. But what's the blueprint? That was the entire premise of this article Marcello wrote today. And the Boise State blueprint is what we're talking about. So the big question on the table for Bryan Harsin is, will the Boise State blueprint work at Auburn? The short answer from this kind of semi-informed person's opinion is, yeah, I think it will. What is the Boise State model, though? Well, there are two things you need to know about the Boise State model. Number one, it's boring. And so number two, it is absolutely what Auburn needs. It's boring because there's not this one secret. It doesn't really look cool on a bumper sticker. There's no ultra proprietary scientific technology that goes into it. It won't win you any press conferences. You won't watch SEC Media Days in 2 weeks and say, boy, Bryan Harsin really won this thing. That's not how you win football games to begin with, though. What it will be is just mastering the mundane, the little boring, everyday tasks that you have to do as a normal person, or you got to do as a left tackle if you're playing for an SEC West power. You got to do those every day at a certain standard in order to achieve at a high standard. Now, that sounds boring. That's why people don't get into it. It's why so many people get fooled in the hiring process to going to someone who promotes their system and who's all about the 1, 2, and 3, and we do these things, and we'll be there in 2 years, and it's all flash, and it's no substance. This is going to be boring when you hear him talk about it. But then when you get results, it's not boring anymore. You may ask, though, well, if it's that simple, if Bryan Harsin just needs to implement this simple day-to-day strategy to win at Auburn, well, how come everyone doesn't do that? Well, exercise and proper diet is about all it takes to be in shape. You see what one of the biggest epidemics in our society is. So it's one thing to be easy in theory. It's a totally different thing to have not only the individual discipline, but here's where it's really hard to be a head coach, the organizational discipline to implement it and have people adhere to that when you're watching them and when you're not watching them. Which brings me to really the crux of this entire question at Auburn. It's not whether Bryan Harsin gets it. It's not whether his model works. Of course it works. Multiple guys have implemented it, himself included, at Boise. It's worked. So you don't have to question whether the approach works. What you have to question is whether he gets enough buy-in from his roster, from his coaching staff, from the entire organization at Auburn, because that's the key. And there's a certain kind of guy who can accomplish that, and they're few and far between, and that's what Alan Green was looking for when he went out to find his head coach. He wanted a guy with a proven process, but then he wanted a guy who was going to come in this case, to totally unfamiliar territory and not let that shake him. And he's going to get in, roll up his sleeves, go to work, get you a staff that knows the back roads and recruiting territories in the SEC, at least to start off with. But then you talk about your player. Auburn's had a little recruiting run of their own right now, but they haven't been flashy about it. It hadn't been a bunch of five-star guys committing to Auburn, but what that staff will tell you is it's our guys. Now, this is not me just baselessly spouting off propaganda for Auburn. What I'm telling you is I'm giving you a fair shake of how things are viewed at Auburn, and that may be a little bit different than how they're viewed outside of Auburn. What Auburn folks, that staff, most importantly, is going to tell you right now, if you were to talk to him, is it doesn't really matter. Like, we got our guys in here. We got guys that we want. We got what we would call Auburn guys in here. And so if we got them, then we don't really care how many stars are next to their name, all due respect. We don't really care necessarily who we had to beat for this guy, who we had to beat for that guy. What we know is we got a development system in place. It's already tried and true. It's proven. And so we don't have to worry about that. We've got every step of this process laid out. What we have to do is we have to get buy-in. But what you're going to find, what Bryan Harsin will find, and he already knows it long before I say it, is in this conference and in the division they play in, there is a minimum baseline of talent that they're going to have. Even if every part of that process is adhered to, because of how good the teams you play are, how talented they are, and how good at developing a lot of those talented teams are too, you're going to have a certain baseline of talent. So you can't Michigan State or Iowa State your way through the SEC and achieve at an SEC championship caliber level. Let me put it that way. The theory works. The principle works. The big question about this whole Boise State approach at Auburn is not will it work in theory. It's do you get enough buy-in collectively? Do you get enough buy-in? Because there's a lot of noise that sometimes you have to deal with when you get higher caliber athletes, when you get a higher profile program, when the heat of the spotlight gets turned up a little bit. There's just a little more noise that you have to deal with sometimes, and there's a little more convincing you have to do sometimes that what you know works. You're convinced of it. They got to be convinced of it. That's the only question I have with Bryan Harsin at Auburn. How quickly can he get full community and organizational buy-in? If he gets that, there'll be a thorn in the side of the SEC for years to come.